Today is a significant day for the inquiry. It's the day we first hear evidence given orally. Thank you for being here in such numbers to take part in it, and by your presence in such numbers to demonstrate the importance of this inquiry. That, together with the force of your feelings, is no doubt why the press have been attracted. I thank them too for being here, to do what the press do best, to report fairly and fearlessly. And I hope that while doing that, they may help to spread the message that those who are struggling with the infections of HIV or hepatitis through blood or blood products are not alone. Anything they can do to increase public knowledge of the symptoms, the causes, and, as so many of you have told me movingly in your witness statements, the consequences of late discovery, of hepatitis C in particular, will be of great value to the public, because so many symptoms of that disease seem to mimic a range of common conditions. Anything that they can do to raise awareness is particularly important, given that there are some 180 million people worldwide who suffer from it, and the World Health Organization has recently announced ambitious plans to eliminate hepatitis C by 2030. And it may be possible, I'm told, for that to happen even earlier in this country. But it depends upon people who think that they might possibly be suffering, knowing enough to be tested, because otherwise the risks of transmission remain, and it takes longer to eliminate what has been a dreadful disease. I want particularly to thank those of you who have given statements. I've already read a large number, more than once, some a number of times. Some are harrowing, some incredibly moving, and some chillingly factual. All are valuable. There are more to come. For many, making a statement has been, and for some it yet will be, an act of bravery. And I'd like to acknowledge that publicly here and now. It may have stirred up, and it may yet stir up, distressing memories. I understand some simply cannot bring themselves to make a statement because it is too much. I want to acknowledge to your patience. It may have seemed a long gap between the end of the preliminary hearings and the start of these oral hearings, but you have, I believe, understood that gathering in witness evidence from so many, identifying repositories of documents and interrogating them, and making the practical arrangements which come with such a large inquiry, all take time. Though I have promised you that the inquiry will be as quick as it can, this has always been accompanied by the assurance that it will be as thorough as is reasonable. And I mean to keep my promise to you, whatever your perspectives on the inquiry. At the preliminary hearings, I set out the principles that were to guide this inquiry. They were first and foremost putting people at its heart, being as quick as reasonable thoroughness permits, paying proper respect to a person's right to be heard, being as open and transparent as is legally possible, being independent of government and frightened of no one in the conclusions it draws, and listening. Though all apply, 4 are of particular importance now as we start hearing evidence orally. First, I promised the inquiry would put people at its heart. The room you are in is, I hope, visible evidence that this inquiry honours its principles. The witness is centre stage, the public in front, lawyers and me to the side. The inquiry is not about them, it's not about me, it's about the evidence which the witness can give. There are rooms to the side and downstairs where anyone who needs space during the hearings can find it. The Red Cross are on hand to assist anyone who finds some of the evidence or their own memories difficult. But it's also about giving people time, as much as physical space and practical arrangements. You know now that the inquiry will spend until October travelling around the UK to make it easier for many to access the hearings. And you can be assured that although it will never be possible to hear orally from everyone who would wish to be heard, those affected and infected will come first and last in the inquiry. Not only in the first few weeks, but the last weeks. Every new written statement the inquiry receives is important. Each will be read, each will be different, each has value. And the evidence of those who have made or will make statements is of real value, whether or not they give evidence orally. Second, can I repeat what I said last September about paying respect to a person's right to be heard? Putting people at the heart of the inquiry must recognise that people have different perspectives to bring to the inquiry. It cannot be just a favoured few, or for that matter, a favoured many, who are at its heart. Those wishing to attribute blame, those wishing to escape blame, those who wish neither, but just seek for an explanation, trying to understand what happened, those who received blood products, those who were transfused with infected blood, those who are patients, those who are doctors, all are people, and all are entitled to be heard with respect. I would ask participants to respect that entitlement. However unpalatable they may find some of the ideas or explanations or accusations which are being expressed. Linked with that, and third, openness demands that the statement of a witness, redacted where appropriate, be published when that witness gives oral evidence. Openness and fairness includes giving those subject to criticism a reasonable opportunity to answer that criticism. Where the response is available at the time a witness statement is published, so too will the responses of any criticised individuals. There may be moments in the testimonies you're about to hear, now and over the coming days, which may bring you close to tears, or they may excite indignation in any reasonable person. That is only human, and I do not ask you to be anything else. But do, please, respect the fact that a witness will be giving evidence. It is never easy to give evidence. Please bear that in mind. And although breaks are always available for witnesses when needed, they will not want to be so overcome themselves by the reaction around them that they cannot bring themselves to finish. Finally, I am here to listen. From reading both witness statements and documents, I know more now than I did last September, and more then than I did when the terms of reference were finalised. Thank you for that. But I know enough to realise that I have much more to learn, and that the oral evidence will be an important part of that. I would ask you now, for your part, having listened to me so patiently, to listen to what Counsel to the Inquiry, Jenny Richards QC, has to say before our first witness, Derek Martindale, comes to be heard. Thank you.
Sir, over the 11 weeks of hearings between now and mid-October, you will hear and the world will hear evidence from some of the thousands of individuals who were infected with HIV, with hepatitis C, in some cases with other infections, in direct consequence of being treated with infected blood or infected blood products by the National Health Service. You will hear from people whose spouse or partner died, whose parent died, whose sibling died, whose child died, in direct consequence of being treated with infected blood or infected blood products by the National Health Service. You will hear how lives have been cut short or irrevocably damaged or altered. You will hear how, in a phrase used in one of the many statements received by the inquiry, people have been forced to live a life that was not the life they were meant to lead. It is important that this evidence is heard and brought out into the open. Firstly, sir, because as you have said, you have pledged to put people at the heart of the inquiry, and that means hearing directly from those who have suffered and doing so before any other evidence is heard. Secondly, because the fulfilment of the inquiry's terms of reference requires the inquiry to examine the treatment of men, women and children who were given infected blood or infected blood products, to examine the extent of any warnings or advice provided to them about the risks, to examine the impact of infection from blood or blood products on those who were infected, their partners, children, parents and others close to them, to examine the adequacy of the information that was or was not provided to them, and to consider the nature and adequacy of the treatment, care and support that was or was not provided in response. The evidence that you will hear, sir, over the coming weeks touches on all of those matters. And thirdly, it is important that this evidence is heard not only by you, sir, and by the inquiry team, but that it should be heard by others, including those in government and in the NHS, pharmaceutical companies, medical practitioners and those who regulate them, and by the general public. As one of the witnesses whom you will hear this week says in her statement, "I'm angry that I haven't been heard for all these years." The witnesses who tell their stories over the coming weeks will be heard. As Sir Brian has said, it will not be possible to hear orally from every witness who has given a statement to the inquiry. There are simply too many for that to be achievable. But those who are not being called to give oral evidence should know that every statement is read and considered by you, sir, and by the inquiry team. Every statement forms part of the material which will in due course inform your recommendations and findings, and every statement will in due course be published by the inquiry. I should say a little about how the evidence will be heard and how these hearings are structured. As many of you already know, over the next 3 months, the inquiry will be hearing evidence from people who've been infected or affected in London, Leeds, Belfast, Edinburgh and Cardiff. The inquiry will return to London for 2 weeks in October to hear further evidence from people who've been infected or affected. Witnesses have been selected to ensure that evidence is heard covering a range of conditions, sources of infection and time periods to help to get to the truth of what happened. There are many who have lived with infection and its terrible consequences for years, and you will hear from them. There are others who have only been very recently diagnosed, and you will hear from them. There will usually be 3 witnesses heard each day. Some days, particularly where there are family groups, there may be 4 or more. The witnesses will be asked questions either by me or by my colleague, Ms. Fraser-Butlin. Where the witness has legal representation, we will ask their barrister at the conclusion of our questions if there are further questions they consider should be asked. The hearings are being live streamed on the inquirer's website, and a transcript of the evidence will be published at the end of each day. And as the Chair has indicated, the statement of each witness who gives oral evidence will also be published on the inquirer's website after each hearing day. Unsurprisingly, given the nature of the issues that are being investigated in this inquiry, many of the witness statements that the inquiry has received criticise named individuals, particularly clinicians. Because the inquiry is under a legal duty to act fairly, those criticisms are, in some cases, depending on the nature of the criticism, brought to the attention of the relevant individual in advance of the witness giving evidence, and the person criticised is afforded an opportunity to respond in writing. Where the person criticised provides the inquiry with such a written response, it will be published on the inquirer's website, either at the same time as the witness's statement or subsequently. But I should emphasise that not all of the criticisms in the statements of people who are infected or affected will go through this process. And that is for the simple reason that many of the statements raise criticisms which will inevitably be the focus and subject of further investigation and examination at later stages of the inquiry's work. Some of the witnesses from whom you will hear have chosen for entirely understandable reasons to give their evidence anonymously, although in each case their identity is known to the inquiry. It is absolutely essential in such cases that their anonymity is preserved, and a range of different measures have been devised to protect their identity. Some witnesses, if they choose to do so, will give evidence via a video link. The Chair has, in exercise of his powers under the Inquiries Act, made a general restriction order which prohibits the disclosure or publication of the name, address, and any other identifying information of anonymous witnesses. This order has been published on the inquiry's website, and there are copies available in the hearing room, and I hope all members of the press have access to them. There are other statements which, although not anonymous, have had particular personal information, particularly information about third parties, redacted, and any disclosure or publication of such redacted material could also contravene the restriction order. Before we call the first witness, there are two further matters to which I should refer. The first is an update as to the work which the inquiry has been undertaking, the further work which it needs to undertake, and the timetabling of future hearings. The second is to raise public awareness of the importance of testing for those at risk of hepatitis from blood and blood products. So, update on the work of the inquiry. The scale of this inquiry is unprecedented. It's been referred to as the biggest public inquiry the United Kingdom has ever undertaken. So far, the inquiry has received 1,200 witness statements, approximately, from individuals who were infected or affected. And we expect to receive at least a further 1,200 statements over the coming months. The inquiry is gathering information and documentation, many of it going back decades, from a very large number of sources. Large-scale searches, both physical and electronic, are being undertaken by the inquiry. By way of example, and these are examples only, a hard copy search of approximately 2.5 million pages of information held by the Department of Health and the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency has been completed, and the inquiry is now moving on to searches of material held by them electronically. The inquiry has searched approximately 2 million hard copy pages of material held by NHSBT. There are approximately 5.7 million pages still to search, as well as material held electronically. The inquiry is also working through the documentation which comprised the disclosed material in the A and National Blood Authority litigation, and that is likely to be the next tranche of material disclosed to core participants. A very large amount of material, particularly central government material, is held at the National Archives. Some has already been scrutinised, but in the next few weeks a team of inquiry searchers will be based there full-time, and their search of those archives is expected to take roughly 6 months. Across the country, the inquiry has identified some 341 separate repositories of documents to be searched either electronically or manually. The inquiry team has carried out electronic searches and undertaken reviews of hard copy material held by the Welsh Government, the Northern Ireland Government, the Northern Ireland Blood and Transplant Service, the Welsh Blood Service, the Public Records Office Northern Ireland, and other core participant organisations in Northern Ireland, Further visits are underway to continue this process, and further searches planned with regard to material held by the Scottish Government and the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. 12,000 electronic documents and 63 hard copy boxes of material have been delivered to the inquiry by BPL Limited, and disclosure exercises are underway in relation to a number of the pharmaceutical companies. Once potentially relevant material has been identified through these investigations, and substantial quantities of potentially relevant material are indeed being identified, that material has to be analysed, scanned, reviewed further, and every page has to be reviewed for redactions before any of it can be disclosed to core participants or the public. It's also right to note that further lines of inquiry and investigation are inevitably generated through this work. In this respect, the process is an iterative and ongoing one. A close review of the documents obtained will often generate further requests for more specific information. All this work inevitably takes time, and in turn this impacts upon the timetable for hearings. The inquiry's current plan for further hearings is as follows. There are 2 weeks in October already dedicated to hearing further oral evidence from those who have been infected or affected. Following those hearings, and probably running into November, the inquiry intends to build upon the evidence that will have been heard from affected individuals by calling clinical evidence, exploring issues of treatment and care, and psychosocial evidence looking in particular at issues of impact. After November, there will be a pause in the inquiry's hearings. The inquiry is currently gathering such a vast amount of material, as I hope the information I've given you indicates, that a pause is necessary to allow that material to be analysed, to be disclosed to core participants, and to enable the inquiry and core participants to prepare for the next set of hearings. The inquiry is aiming for the next set of hearings, which will focus on the knowledge, decisions, actions, and omissions of all relevant decision makers and the response of government and others, to begin in late spring 2020, not before Easter 2020, with a precise date to be announced in due course. We do not believe it will be possible to do justice to the issues that must be investigated under the inquiry's terms of reference in any shorter timescale. So the final point is to emphasise a point you've already made, and that's the vital importance of testing those at risk of hepatitis from infected blood or infected blood products. Those listening will recall that somewhat controversially, the only recommendation from the Penrose inquiry was for a look-back screening programme. It is apparent from the statements which the inquiry has been studying that there are people who have been living with undiagnosed hepatitis C for years, even decades. And you will hear over the coming weeks from witnesses who've only recently been diagnosed with HCV caused by transfusions from blood or blood products many years ago. The Hepatitis C Trust continues to receive calls from people who have only recently been diagnosed and who contracted the virus through infected blood or blood products. And it seems likely that there may be many people, potentially many thousands of people, who remain unaware that they may have been so infected as a result of the receipt of infected blood or infected blood products. One further issue which has emerged from the witness statements is a lack of information, in particular on the part of general practitioners, about hepatitis C. And NHS England has this month issued a letter to all GP practitioners, the stated aim of which is to help them support patients who may have been exposed to risks associated with infected blood or blood products. Paul, could we have that letter on screen? Could you go to the second page? Okay. You will see there under the heading Action, I hope most of you can see screens. I'm sorry that not all of you can, but we can make available a copy of this letter on the inquiry website for those who can't. That NHS England have drawn to the attention of clinicians the fact that hepatitis C often doesn't have noticeable symptoms until the liver's been significantly damaged, and when symptoms do occur, they can be mistaken for another condition. Common symptoms are identified, and NHS England's letter continues that the only way to know for certain if these symptoms are caused by hepatitis C is to get tested. Clinical staff should therefore consider asking patients who present with non-specific symptoms whether they may have had blood or blood products, and offering them a screen for blood-borne viruses. Thank you, Paul. The inquiry brings that letter to public attention, particularly given the presence of so many of the press today, in the hope that it may encourage greater awareness on the part of clinicians, as well as greater awareness amongst the public more widely of these issues. So that's all I propose to say by way of any opening submissions or statement, and we're now ready to call the first witness, Derek Martindale.
Thank you very much, Ms. Richards. Mr. Martindale, I think you want to be known as Derek for the purposes of the inquiry.
Please state your name.
Derek Martindale.
And please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yep. Questions are going to come from Ms. Richards.
Derek, you're here to give evidence about what happened to you and your family, and you've got your son, John, sitting beside you.
Yes.
And your wife, Margaret, in the front row to provide you with support. If at any time during your evidence you need a break, please don't hesitate to say so. You should, I hope, also have, in case you need to refer to it, a copy of your witness statement there. Derek, you have haemophilia A.
Yes.
And the vast majority of people here will, I know, be familiar with it, but it's a bleeding disorder, in effect, which is characterised by a deficiency of factors in the blood which are essential for blood clotting.
Yes.
And the type of haemophilia that you have is haemophilia A.
Yes.
And so a deficiency of clotting factor 8.
Correct.
And your haemophilia is classed as severe. What does that mean in practice for you?
Excuse me. A very low percentage of clotting factor, I guess almost 0, which means that spontaneous bleeds, traumatic bleeds, accidents cause internal bleeding and some external bleeding, and the blood takes a long time to clot.
And
Just for a moment, I think we're losing some of the force of what Derek is saying because of the position of the microphone. I wonder if he can just be moved round a little bit in front of him, or for that matter, he comes a little bit this way. It might be easier. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Thank you.
Derek?
Yes, that's fine.
your haemophilia A was diagnosed, I think, when you were very young.
Yes.
And you had a younger brother, Richard,
Yes.
who was diagnosed also with severe haemophilia A at a very young age.
Around the same age. Yes.
Now, you've said in your witness statement that you were under the care of York District Hospital for most of your childhood through to about 1987, is that right?
Correct.
And there wasn't, I think, a dedicated haemophilia centre there, but you were under the care of a haemophilia consultant called Dr. Wiley for much of that time. You received blood products on account of your haemophilia over a number of years, is that right?
Yes.
You've very helpfully produced, as an exhibit to your witness statement, and hopefully the documents will come up on screen for you in a moment, extracts from your medical records. Paul, could we have, please, document 1688002? And if you could just carry on through, Paul, till we get to about page 14. Thank you. So we can see here, Derek, a list of the factor products that you received over the years. Paul, would you go to the next page, please? And here we have 1984 receiving different types of blood products, NHS 8 and then ARM 8, Armour 8. Is that Factor 8 products that you received?
Yes.
And then if we could go, please, Paul, to 1688003. There should come up, Derek, in a moment, another extract from your records. Next page. Thank you. And if you could highlight, Paul, please, 1985 and 1984. Do you see there, Derek, the extract from your records, which summarises the blood products which you were receiving, in particular in 1984 and 1985?
I do, yes.
Could I ask you to tell the inquiry what illnesses you were infected with as a result of being given those blood products?
HIV and hepatitis C.
Now, it's right, I think, that you don't know the precise date of your infection or the precise batch that caused your infection, or indeed batches. But you've estimated in your witness statement that it appears to have been sometime between August 1984 and August 1985.
Based on some of the records that were sent by the UK National Haemophilia Database, yes.
And I think we can put that up. Again, it's 1688003. Please, Paul. So if you go through to what might be about page 7, please. We need to turn its landscape. Thank you. So if we look here, Derek, we've got at the an entry, date last negative, 3rd of August 1984, date first positive, 15th of August 1985.
Yes.
And is that the basis for your understanding that you were infected with HIV as a result of receiving blood products at some point between those two dates?
It is.
Thank you. That can go down now. Do you know whether your parents were told anything, given any information or advice about the risk of infection from blood products during your childhood?
No. No. I doubt it very much that they had.
By 1984, you were about 20 years old, and so an adult.
Yes.
Were you ever told anything about the risk of infection from blood products at any of the clinical appointments you attended?
No. No.
Can you tell us how it was you found out that you'd been infected with HIV?
Excuse me. It's, I recall around sometime in August 85, following all the reports, the articles in the newspapers regarding AIDS, how this plague was spreading across the globe, and how there were certain high-risk groups, high risk of infection, haemophiliacs being one of them. So I felt in August 85 I should go and ask the hospital to be tested.
So you proactively went to ask to be tested. No one invited you for a test.
That's correct.
The test was undertaken and came back positive.
Yes.
Can you recall anything about how those test results were communicated to you?
I was told, I remember the date because it was Friday the 13th, September 85, went at lunchtime to get the results, and I was told that I was HIV positive. I was told I had about a year to live. I I was told not to tell anybody, including my family and my parents.
And you were 23 years old then, I think?
Yes.
You've described in your statement having been told not to tell anyone because of the stigma associated with the infection would mean you would become a social pariah.
That's pretty much what was said, yes.
And this was by Dr. Wiley,
Yes.
who I think you said was in fact very upset as he communicated this information to you.
He was. He'd been my and my brother's doctor for many years. So he was a friend of the family in a sense, as much, not just a doctor.
What information or advice, other than the bleak prognosis and the advice not to tell anyone, were you given at that stage? Was there anything else said to you?
Positively, no. In a sense that there was no treatment, and the idea is that you would have a year to live.
You kept the secret, I think, for a while.
I did.
What kind of burden did that impose upon you?
Difficult. It's a bit of a oxymoron in a sense that when you're young, you're invincible. When you're 23, you have a life. You're generally fit, apart from the bleeds. But then you're told you have 12 months to live. It's very hard to comprehend that. So there was the fear. It became more and more prominent in the media, and the government health warnings that AIDS was a killer, and we're all going to die. But again, I guess there's the confidence of youth that I can't believe this is going to happen to me.
You've described in your statement how in those early years the worst thing was the mental impact rather than the physical impact of the infection.
That is correct.
And that's partly, is it because of the sense that you only had a limited amount of time ahead of you?
There was that. Yes, there was no future. The likelihood of getting married and having children was very unlikely. And the fact that you were told that you're going to infect people if you have a relationship. I believe sharing toothbrushes, kissing. In those early days, there was so much uncertainty on how the infection was going to happen, how you could contaminate somebody else.
And in those early days, were you able to talk to anybody at all about what you were going through?
I don't recall the exact date, but at the time. But obviously, my brother was infected, so we could talk. And a small group of friends became very supportive. But not my parents.
In April 1987, you moved to London, and I think you came under the care then of St Thomas's Hospital.
Yes.
You've mentioned your brother Richard, and he was also infected with HIV.
Yes.
Again, as a direct result of the treatment with infected blood products he'd been given for his haemophilia A.
Yes.
Can you tell us what happened to Richard, please?
It's one of those things that I've always wondered, being possibly genetically very similar, why things went the way they did. But he became ill. Things didn't work out for him, died in 1990.
As a direct result of HIV having developed into AIDS?
Yes.
I think you feel in part you're here to give evidence for Richard.
For Richard and for everybody else who doesn't have a voice anymore.
And is there anything you'd like to tell us about Richard, the kind of person that he was?
He was full of life. He was a crazy youngster. He was a haemophiliac. He got a job as a painter and decorator. So he'd spend half his days standing on a ladder. The haemophilia doctor wasn't very pleased about that. He worked for a painter and decorators who did some work in Castle Howard in North Yorkshire. So we always say my brother has some painting in the art gallery up in Castle Howard. He was a very full of life person.
And how old was Richard when he died?
He was 23.
I think it was just shortly before his 24th
Just shortly before his
birthday.
24th birthday.
You've described something in your statement that I know you're happy to be asked about, if that's the right way of putting it. You've described something that you called the biggest regret of your life in your statement, and it concerns you and Richard. What would you like to say about that?
It is. As I was down in London, having moved down to London, his sister was getting married back in York. This was in August 1990. Richard was very ill at the time. He was pretty much wasting away in a sense. But I went up for my sister's wedding the night before. We all went out, friends, relatives, and my sister had moved out of her flat back into her parents' house just for the night before the wedding. So Richard and I were staying there, just the two of us at the end of the night, and he knew he was dying. He knew he had AIDS, and that he didn't have long to live. And he just wanted to talk. He wanted to talk about this, talk about his fears, how scared he was. But I couldn't. It was too close to home for me, and I wasn't there for him. And 3 months later, he died. It's the biggest regret of my life because he's gone, and I can't do anything to make amends for that.
You've also said in your statement that your diagnosis, that of your brother's, tore your family apart.
Yes.
Your parents reacted badly.
And I think that emotionally that they just couldn't cope with it. And the death of Richard was obviously a horrendous thing for the whole family.
Your father took to seeking solace in alcohol and
Yes.
died in 2000, aged 61.
Yes.
And your mother struggled to cope with the diagnosis and simply wasn't able to talk about it.
Yes.
What was the ongoing effect of your HIV diagnosis on relationships and your private life?
Not an option. Firstly, you're going to die very soon. Secondly, sexual relationships were the main cause of infection. and the fear and the stigma in general society. Who'd want to know somebody who was infected with HIV and was going to die very shortly?
I think you had, before you met your wife, you had one long-term relationship that you described, which lasted about 2 years.
Yes.
And there came a point as your relationship developed that you felt you had to tell your girlfriend, your then girlfriend, about the HIV status. What was the eventual outcome of that?
She was very upset. A few tears, of course. But then after a few weeks, she left me. She said she couldn't stand and watch me die.
In 1991, you met Margaret.
Yes.
Your wife. Again, how did the impact of your HIV diagnosis affect the early stages of that relationship?
Not well. There was that playing hot and cold in that you relax, you probably go out, you have a few drinks, and you start to think, I'm normal. You know, I'm okay. This is going to work. Then you wake up the next day and think, I can't do this. This is so wrong. This is so wrong to hurt this person. And that's how it went.
But there came a point where you did tell her.
I did.
And what was Margaret's reaction?
Is that it? Is that it? That was a wonderful response.
You married in March 1992.
Yes.
But at that time, how long did you think you were going to have in this marriage?
2-3 years, good health, and then she'd be nursing me.
What was the impact of that shared knowledge that you then had on the early years of your married life?
One of the things that Margaret said just when we met was that when she found if we're going to make a relationship, there should be no secrets. She'd seen how I'd been before, and how not talking to anybody, not being able to say anything to anybody about this, how messed up that had made me. So she said, if we're going to make a relationship and we're going to get married, we have to be truthful. And we don't hide anything.
And you took the decision, I think, not to tell your son until he was an adult.
Yes.
And that, I think you say in your statement, was because you wanted to spare him the worry that you and Margaret had of a potential impending death sentence, and wanted him to have a normal childhood and, as far as he was concerned, a healthy dad.
Yes.
In 1997, you became aware, I think, that you'd also been infected with hepatitis C.
Correct.
Can you recall anything about being told that or what was said?
I don't. A lot, to be honest. My wife recalls it better than I do, in that she was recounting when we were with relatives how it had been mentioned at a visit to the hospital. It obviously didn't sink in, but she did remember that they had said hepatitis C.
Had you consented to being tested for hepatitis C?
No.
Were you even aware that you were being tested for hepatitis
No.
C? Now, in the mid-1990s, you were advised to start taking AZT as the only available HIV treatment at the time.
That's correct.
You'd been reluctant to do that for a while. Why was that?
because AZT was the only treatment available for HIV at that time. And I'd been lucky, I'd been well, and AZT was my safety net. If everything went wrong, started AZT. But then when I thought that if I start taking AZT, and that doesn't work, and it didn't work for a lot of people, no more safety net.
When you did take it, what side effects, if any, did it have?
Side effects were pretty bad. I guess times of nausea. I developed a foot fungus. I developed a nose infection. I guess a blunderbuss kind of treatment.
Now, you've told us that you'd remained reasonably physically well, but you have in fact had pneumonia, pleurisy, other infections in consequence of your HIV diagnosis. Is that right?
Yes.
And you've had to have periods in hospital, you've had to have periods off work as a result?
Yes.
Treatment for the HCV, 2002, I think, you started on a course of interferon. What was that like in terms of side effects?
Oh, that was the worst. That was horrendous, both physically and mentally. It can lead to the onset of depression, and how it's like having flu all the time. So you lose your appetite, so you lose weight. You're feeling down, depressed, so you stop interacting with people around you, with family around you.
The phrase in your witness statement was you became a shadow of yourself.
Yes.
And that treatment, was it successful?
No.
So you continued to be co-infected with HIV and HCV, and then in 2010 you tried another course of treatment interferon for the HCV. What can you tell us about that second treatment experience?
So the first one was for 6 months, didn't work. The second one was for 12 months. We approached it having had a bit more experience of this, so I'd like to think we're a bit more prepared. One of the stipulations, my loving wife, was that I start taking antidepressants when I start the 12 months treatment, and the organisation I was working for at the time, Kew Gardens, they were incredibly supportive of me during this time. The periods that I was off work, the flexibility within the working environment.
And as well as the antidepressants, you had regular appointments with a psychiatrist during that course of treatment?
Yes, yes.
And that helped you cope better?
I think it did. It did.
But the physical side effects were just
and
as
having
bad.
had the experience of it before, knowing what to expect a bit more. But physically, yes, just as bad, or 6 months worse than the previous time.
Now, that treatment did clear the HCV.
Yes.
Do you know whether there has been lasting damage to your liver as a result of the years before that was cleared?
There is scarring, and there is some cirrhosis, I believe. Yes.
What current treatments do you take in relation to the HIV infection?
I take 3 tablets a day for that. I can never remember what they are.
Do those have side effects?
No.
Now, have you, in experienced any difficulties or obstacles in obtaining these treatments, whether for the HIV, hepatitis C, or indeed for your haemophilia?
No.
What about dental treatment?
Dental treatment has been generally good. I used to go to Guy's Hospital a lot at their dental school. Now it's a local dental practitioner for general work. If there were to be an extraction, it would be back to the hospital. I was just... I don't know if you want me to carry on.
Absolutely.
That was just a time early on during the period of CJD being in the headlines, being haemophiliacs being a high risk group for infection from that, going to the dentist at the time, you would be felt to feel a bit unclean. Everybody would be suited, protective clothing. Everything that they were going to treat you with would then be destroyed, fumigated afterwards. It wasn't a fact that you couldn't. I know some dental practices wouldn't take high-risk people because of the danger of CJD infection, but I didn't have any problems getting the treatment. It was just you felt unclean.
And there came a point when you were offered counselling after you'd moved to under the care of St Thomas's Hospital. What form did that take, and how did you find it?
There was a Saturday afternoon support group of the haemophiliacs who were infected, and their spouses, partners, or friend would get together. Self-support group.
And did you find that helpful?
To start with, yes, it was good to know you weren't in the same. You weren't. There was always that feeling of isolation, the stigma that came with the stigma, the isolation. So it was good to know. Sorry, it's not good to know. You weren't alone. Somebody would say something, and yeah, I'd been feeling that same thing, and you thought you were the only one who had those feelings. But over time, unfortunately, it changed. People started to get ill. People started to die. And when you were going up for the next one, you'd be wondering who would be turning up. Who's looking worse than they were last time. So I'm afraid it didn't start out. It didn't end as well as it started.
Your statement makes very clear that for you, your main source of support, your bastion of support, has been your wife, Margaret.
Yes. It's my time before Margaret, and it's my time since Margaret.
How has everything that's happened, everything that you've related in your evidence, how has it affected and shaped your life?
Apart from the social issues we talked about, there are the career, professional effects on that. I started working in the public sector in 1985, a bit earlier actually than 1985, 83 I think it was, and I was working with them, with the public sector, when I was diagnosed HIV. And they knew that if I wanted to go somewhere else, I would never get through the pre-employment examination. This would come up, and I wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't take me on. So my freedom of career, the ability to move, was restricted.
And you felt that you've had to remain in the public sector for that reason for the majority of your working life?
There were the two reasons. One, yes, nobody else would take me on. I'm going to go, and the other one was that the public sector had a reasonable, had a good death in service benefit. So I knew that if anything happened to me, there would be something to look after my wife and my son.
You, I think, make clear in your statement you would have been unable to get any form of life insurance.
No, there was no life insurance.
And you described feeling trapped but unable to pursue a career in the private sector whilst my wife and son were dependent upon me. In a sense, I was worth more dead than alive.
Yes.
Can I then just ask you about the schemes, the financial assistance schemes, and your experiences in relation to those? You received an ex gratia payment as a single person in 1991. Were there any stipulations or conditions attached to the receipt of that payment, as far as you can recall?
As we had to take we had to write we had to sign a waiver that we would not seek or take action against the government, any further action with regards to the HIV infection or any possible future infection, whatever that may be. And I believe that everybody had to sign it, otherwise nobody would get a payout, so if you didn't want to sign it, it wasn't just your choice, you were affecting other people as well.
And you have received some financial payments from the Macfarlane Trust and the Skipton Fund, and you now receive some payments from the English Infected Blood Support Scheme.
Yes.
Do you have any particular views or experiences in relation to the operation of the scheme or the nature of the payments that you want to make?
I don't know.
And then the final question I wanted to ask you, Derek, arising out of your statement, was just about medical records. Because you sought your medical records at a point in time in which you were part of some litigation that was ongoing in the US. Is that right? And the records that you sought in the course of that litigation were fairly comprehensive from 1964 for about 20 years. But there was very little at all in relation to the period July 84 through to your move to London in April 1987. Is that right?
Yes.
So in terms of the critical period in terms of infection and testing and diagnosis in relation to the HIV, you found almost nothing in your records.
Nothing.
And you've asked St Thomas's if notes were transferred from York when you first came under their care, and I think the answer to that was no.
They said no.
And you also say in your statement you've spoken to others who were in a similar position to you, people with haemophilia involved in that US litigation, who've reported to you a similar experience in relation to their medical records.
Yes.
Those are the questions I had for you. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I'm honoured to be here today, for one thing. It is about it is good that this is happening now. Because although things may have changed over the past 30 years or so, HIV, Hep C, I believe there is still a sort of stigma associated with it, even today. And I think society needs to move on from that. And I hope this helps with that.
So I'm just going to turn my back and ask Mr. Snowden, who, as you know, represents you, if there's anything further.
Please, you didn't want that. Sorry, Mum will be pleased you didn't want that. Didn't I?
So just one point which Mr. Snowden asks me to raise. It goes back to the UKHCDO data, the haemophiliac database data. I don't think we need to put it on screen, but you'll recall I showed you the document with the dates, which showed when you first tested negative and then first tested positive. And the date of the first test gives a date of 1984. Were you aware of being tested at all in relation to HIV at any point in 1984 or at any point prior to the time you went to the hospital and asked to be tested in 85?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Derek, for coming to give your evidence and being the first of our witnesses in particular. And thank you, John Paul, for supporting your father. We'll take a break. We may be able to start, I think, the next witness, Dr. Hill, in about a quarter of an hour, but we'll just take a break till then.
We're ready for the next witness. Thank you.
Ms. Richards, the next witness wishes to be known, does she, as Dr. Hill?
Yes.
Please state your full name.
Carole Ann Hill.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Dr. Hill, yours is an academic, not a medical doctorate.
Yes.
You discovered in January 2017, just over 2 years ago, that you had hepatitis C.
Yes.
And that you were infected with hepatitis C as a result of a blood transfusion you had in 1987.
Yes.
So for 30 years you were unaware that you had hepatitis C.
Indeed.
And you found that out, I think, only in the course of investigations for other health problems.
Yes.
Can I take you back to January 1987 then? And can you tell us a little about how the need for a transfusion arose and what happened?
I had suffered from menorrhagia for some years, heavy periods for those who don't know what that is. Lots of heavy bleeding. I was treated with hormones and other types of treatment which didn't work for me. I was investigated at one of the London hospitals internally and found no sign of any cause. So I was in a state where I was getting more and more anemic to a very critical degree. And it became apparent that I needed a blood transfusion quite urgently at that time.
And your statement describes a very vivid memory of the circumstances in which you had the blood transfusion. Are you able to tell us a little about that?
Well, we were snowed in for a start, so I don't remember why it was decided that had to be the day, but I was driven to the hospital in a 4x4 owned by a friend. The hospital was virtually inaccessible in Cromer in Norfolk, and I was told that blood was being flown in by helicopter along with the sliced bread. And that was the only information I was given. And I was eventually lashed up to the machinery, and it took about 2 days to transfuse 5 units.
And you have a memory, I think, of whilst that transfusion was ongoing, of listening to the radio,
Yes.
to Radio 4, and hearing something. What did you hear?
Yes, it was. I thought it was quite amusing at the time. There was a broadcast about the growing information about the transmission of HIV via blood transfusion. So I was lying there feeling a bit like a rat in a trap, unable to move. And then I started to have a rigor, which is a severe tooth-chattering shaking, which I'd never experienced before. And nurses came rushing in, thinking I might be being transfused with the wrong group, checked the wristband, perfectly all right, and went off and left me to it.
And in 1987, when you were having that transfusion, were you given any information at all or any advice about any risk of infection that might be associated with the transfusion?
No, not at all.
You've had a number of medical investigations since then. We'll come on to those that are particularly relevant for the purposes of your evidence today. But in the course of the various multiple investigations you've had over the years, has anyone asked you whether you've had a transfusion in the past?
No. Despite my weird blood tests.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, Dr. Hill. You've related in your statement abnormalities or irregularities being reported to you as early as May 1987.
Yes.
Was any explanation ever given to you as to what those abnormalities were?
No, not in a full sense, although it would have been probably lost on me. I'm not a scientist. But they were various aspects, threads in my blood test didn't hold together. But everybody started to say, this was through several GPs, 3 different GPs over 30 years. Oh, well, I guess that's normal for you.
And no one ever asked about your medical history, the history of transfusion in the 80s?
No, not at any time.
If we come forward in time to November 2016, you were having various blood tests and scans at the local hospital. And if we have on screen, please, Paul, 002407. It should come up on the screen in front of you, Dr. Hill. I hope. No, sorry, I must have given you the wrong reference there. It's the exhibits to Dr. Hill's statement, please, Paul. What was the number there?
245. Sorry, 240 05 001.
Well, I think I might deal with it simply by reading out to you a passage whilst we try and sort that out. You received a letter in November 2016 from your consultant hepatologist and gastroenterologist indicating that they were going to do a blood test looking out for markers of gynecological problems, and then they'd see you back in clinic to discuss whether they needed to do anything further about your liver. Do you recall?
Yes.
Ah, here we are. We have it on screen. Thank you. And we can see there's a passing reference to discussions about your liver.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the case that, in fact, the blood tests that were actually carried out included a test for hepatitis C.
Yes, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was my next question. Indeed, Dr. Hill. Were you told you were going to be tested for hepatitis C?
No, not at any time.
You can take that down, thanks, Paul. How was your diagnosis of hepatitis C communicated to you?
By letter, which was half opened and not sealed properly. In response, I was cross about that, and I wrote a letter in reply, which I think you've probably got on record as well, suggesting that although I understood that this might be one of a tranche of tests that would take place, it seemed to me that the patient should be informed in advance of that testing and warned accordingly. And would he kindly not tell people by letter in future? But I gather that's standard procedure.
Well, let's see if we can get that letter up on screen, Paul. That's that one, and then that one. So the letter that you received from the consultant, January 2017, I hope we'll be able to find it. Here we are.
Yes.
Dear Dr. Hill, I've now seen all the results from your liver blood tests and follow-up bloods from clinic. Rather surprisingly, they've shown you have a chronic viral infection with a hepatitis virus called hepatitis C, and I would like to see you in clinic to discuss the implications of this and what we can do about it. So that was the first you knew that you'd been tested?
Yes.
And that's how the diagnosis was communicated to you?
Yes.
And I think we have the letter you've referred to, the follow-up letter that you wrote on the 29th of January. Could we just highlight the second paragraph, please, Paul? To receive such a diagnosis. And this is what you wrote in response. To receive such a diagnosis by letter was an incredible shock and, in my view, totally inappropriate for a patient who'd not even been told that she was being tested for Hep C. On reflection, I realised such testing may be standard, but some indication should be given to the patient. And you were writing that to try and ensure that other patients weren't put in a similar position. Thank you. You can take that down, Paul. You're very critical in your statement of the information being communicated to you in that way. I think you describe it as entirely inappropriate. How do you feel such a potentially life-altering piece of medical information and diagnosis should be communicated to a patient?
How it should be. I think you need to be fully informed of what you're being tested for. I realise I turned up as a blank page, as it were, but I think if you were having banks of blood tests, as I was, at each stage, perhaps a bit of information wouldn't go astray, and so you had some idea of where you were being pointed. There was very little communication with the consultant at this level anyway. I think I only saw him twice ever. So it's, I think if you're only going to see a consultant on that sort of basis, information please.
And in terms of the actual communication of the diagnosis, you think that should be done in person rather than by letter?
Of course it should, yes, absolutely.
You did see the consultant after that.
After my letter.
After your letter. What information or guidance or advice can you recall being given about the hepatitis C infection? For example, about the risks of transmission, further transmission?
Not a lot, really. I don't remember discussing that. He did talk to me about priorities and waiting lists and so on, but I don't think we discussed transmission.
Now, you had and have had a number of other health problems, which I think looking back now, you wonder whether some of them may have been, at the very least, contributed to by the hepatitis C of which you were unaware for so many years. You've had a diagnosis and been treated for cancer.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, during these many tests, which crossed me over into a different department, gynecology and oncology, at the same time, within weeks of each other, really, I had a diagnosis of ovarian cancer, which I'm assuming wouldn't have been found had I not been starting off with the blood testing for the liver query problems at the time. It was a sort of double whammy. I was being bounced from department to department, I felt, and nobody was talking to each other. In fact, I think I mentioned it in a letter to the doctor concerned to say, is this my responsibility to communicate with the other consultant, or can I take it that you will do it? Because there's a lot happening for me at the moment, and nobody seems to know what's happening. Phone calls, it took me, I was a month finding out about the cancer because nobody would answer the phone. And I found out by accident when I was talking to a junior GP about something else.
And you've suggested in your witness statement that there might be a link between the hepatitis C and the cancer. And you've done some of your own research with the assistance of your husband, who's a retired doctor.
Yes, he found it rather than I did. I can't say I was eager to research at that point. But yes, he does a lot of reading of research papers, American research papers largely. And he told me that there'd been intimations that there may be some links. But more than that, I don't know. I've since tried to recover this information, but haven't been able to find it. But as I say, I'm not a science person.
And you've also experienced a lot of joint pain.
Oh, yes.
Osteoarthritis.
That got very suddenly worse.
That pain's got worse. And you think that increase in severity of the pain and discomfort may have been related to the treatment you subsequently have undertaken for the hepatitis C.
Yes, indeed.
You've also, I think, had a skin reaction. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, my skin started to fall off. It looked red, a bit like eczema to start with, but then it sort of crept around a bit and started flaking off. I did mention it a consultant in passing, but it was very much in passing, and I was really patted on the head and told, "Oh, you're nearly finished the antivirals now. We won't be bothering with it."
But again,
Really.
you think that may have been
Well, I didn't have it
an
before.
effect of the
Yes.
treatment that you underwent
Yes,
for the hepatitis
yes.
C. And then you also describe in your statement a degree of bleeding and swelling that you've experienced for many years since the
Yes.
transfusion.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little about that?
Yes, I have bleeds in my fingers and feet. Just turning a door handle can do it. I have tried to get advice on it over a 20-year period, but unless people can actually see it, by the time you've got to see somebody, the colour changes and the blackness of the fingers and toes is gone by the time you get your appointment. And so it was another question of being patted on the head and sent away, really.
So there's not been any investigations or follow-ups to explore whether there's any interrelationship between that?
Even now, no. Although I have mentioned it recently.
And then you've also been suffering from high blood pressure.
Yes, that's a new thing.
Which again you've attributed in part, not I think in full, but in part to the stress arising from the belated diagnosis and the treatment that you've had to undergo for it.
Yes, I didn't know about it before. Didn't have it before, as far as I'm aware. I've always had a low blood pressure.
Can I ask you then to tell us about the treatment that you received for the hepatitis C? What information or options were given to you about the treatment at the outset?
Well, the nurses were the star turns in the whole treatment, in my experience, because they seemed to do all the work and all the support and all the information. And I was told at the beginning that at the moment they were using a 1 dose a day treatment and how much better it was. But by the time I'd gone through the oncology department and been bounced back again, because I refused treatment, chemotherapy for the cancer, and on the statistics given me, I was told that the monthly budgeting had changed and that we were now up to 4, sometimes 5 tablets a day. So that's what I'd be getting. So that's as it was, but I reacted so badly to the ribavirin that I could only tolerate it for about 10 days and I had to come off it. It was a very weird experience.
So you had your diagnosis of hepatitis C in January 2017.
Yes.
I think was it October 2017 when you started to receive treatment?
Yes, but months later, after I'd had surgery.
And that's in part because you were having investigations and surgery in
yes,
relation to the cancer.
Yes.
What other side effects did you experience from that treatment? How did it affect you?
Well, the ribavirin was the worst because although you don't feel as you normally feel when you're on antivirals, I think your mind is set on the fact that you're doing it for 12 weeks and that's the way it's going to be. But the ribavirin was almost like an out-of-body experience, although that sounds a bit dramatic. But it certainly does weird things to your head as well as your body. I know Derek was saying about feeling like flu. It was a bit like walking through deep water. I can't really explain how it was, but it was unbearable.
And you've said in your statement, it wasn't so much like a physical feeling, but very much in my head. It was both depressing and debilitating, and I was reluctant to leave the house. I became very short-tempered, upset, lacking patience, and generally felt very overwhelmed.
Yes, I think that's about a good summary.
And a summary in your own words.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Statement. The treatment for the hepatitis C concluded in January 2018.
Yes.
And what was the outcome of that treatment?
I responded very quickly. In fact, I think I was clear of virus after a month's treatment. I was very lucky. I was one of the fortunate ones. I feel a bit fraudulent being here because I haven't had the extremes that obviously so many people have.
And you, at the time you drafted your statement, you were due to have another checkup in January of this year.
Yes.
I think you've had that checkup and you're still clear.
Yes, thank you.
Now, obviously you lived for very many years, for decades, with hepatitis C, but not knowing that you had hepatitis C. looking back at your life during that period, do you see now that you were experiencing symptoms such as fatigue and other symptoms during that time?
Absolutely, but I think a lot of women think that's normal. Especially at a certain age.
And you've again described in your statement sensations throughout that period of time of feeling plagued by fatigue.
Yes.
And you put it this way: I used to be very proactive and busy. Since my transfusion have been plagued by fatigue. And indeed, you say you began to think it was anemia or normal, but now you think unlikely. Now you understand that it was almost certainly the consequence of the hepatitis C.
Yes.
What was the reaction of your family to this late diagnosis?
Well, I was very lucky in my family because I come from a family of medics, so I didn't get a shock horror. The sort of horror result. My husband is very much older than me, and he was immensely shocked. In fact, he had, and it certainly affected his health. But I think he'd never had to think that I might die before he did before.
Yes, I think you've said in your statement again that your husband had to confront the possibility that you might not outlive him.
Yes.
And what about the reaction of your children?
My children were great because they know me. And there wasn't, and how could it be other than shock and disbelief, really? I mean, everybody's story is unbelievable, and when you hear the details, and they know the sort of life I've lived, so...
You tried at one point after the diagnosis counselling,
Yes.
which you ended up arranging privately, paying for yourself. How was that?
To be honest, and I'm never against counselling, having practiced it a bit in the past, in part of my life. But yeah, I didn't find it helpful. It was abreactive, in as much as I'd just sit there and cry, and I can do that for free at home.
Dr. Hill, you discussed in your statement the application you made to the Skipton Fund and then to the EIBSS scheme for financial assistance. I'm not going to ask you about the detail of any of the payments you received, but I just wanted to ask you about the application process. You're an academic who is used to dealing with a lot of words and a lot of text, and so you were able, you say, to complete the form.
It did cross my mind that some people might struggle with it, though, who not had to do anything like that.
And you said in your statement it wasn't always clear precisely what questions were being asked or for what purpose in the course of the application.
It wasn't sort of linear in some respects.
Dr. Hill, those are the only questions I had for you. But is there anything else that you would like to say about your experiences or the late diagnosis that you'd like to take this opportunity to say?
Yes, thank you. I don't think it's particularly helpful at this juncture to start pointing fingers at medical professionals who largely didn't know what they were dealing with when they were prescribing transfusions. That's not where the problem started. But the awareness should have been very much more than it has been in the last couple of years than 30 years ago, when we were all in the dark to some degree, except people were beginning to know about HIV. I think it's... I understand the NHS is imploding and shortages of suitably qualified people to deal with us all, certainly as we age. But we do need to be informed better than we are. And I have to say I've spent a lot of time communicating myself between different departments because they just didn't do it, or if they did it at all, it wasn't effectively done. And it causes great loss of time, and time is of the essence if you're mortally ill. And I think we need to change that, and I think that's one of the key things that this inquiry can do, is to increase that awareness. And the fact that there are thousands of people out there who, like me, didn't have the least idea. that they got hepatitis C, and there may be a whole wave of more work coming from that. And I hope it's going to be handled a darn sight better than it has been up to now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hill.
Please sit down. There was just one thing I wanted to ask. When Miss Richards asked you, and you said about your children's reaction and how they were just astounded, flabbergasted at what had happened, you said because they knew the sort of life you'd led.
Yes.
Can you just tell me what you meant by that?
Well, I think when the consultant informed me by letter and expressed their surprise, I was given many more tests, I think, than lots of people were, blood tests, because I didn't fit the stereotype, it seems to me. And he was so surprised that I would have it. And that seemed a bit out of order to me.
What did you think the stereotype was?
I assumed from what he said that I wasn't an obvious drug injector, and I hadn't been a sex worker, and I've only had one sexual partner in a lifetime, so I wasn't maybe what they were looking for. That's a stereotype in itself. I understand that. But I don't understand why you'd express such extreme surprise of finding that I had an infection that thousands of other people have got.
So when you're calling for greater awareness,
Yes.
You're calling for that amongst people who have no reason to think that they might be infected by hepatitis C.
Indeed.
Because they haven't turned their mind to a transfusion they might have had.
Indeed, and one thing that struck me when I was talking to somebody yesterday was that I became aware, because of the sort of household I live in, that there was much more public information broadcasting around the time that AIDS was becoming known. So, like other people who donated blood before, I knew that if I'd received blood before 1992, if I went back and offered to donate, I'd be turned away. Not because I thought there was anything wrong with me, but because I was within that time margin where it was an unknown for thousands of people. So I never did donate blood knowing that information. But there are lots of people who either didn't hear it or have been transfused and infected that way. But it could become a vicious circle if people who were infected in ignorance went on donating blood, although I know there are tests now to check the blood. But in the early days, I don't think there was much available.
Well, that's all that I was going to ask. I'm sorry to bring you back to
Okay.
have to answer that. But thank you very much indeed, Dr. Hill. Thank you, Ms. Richards. Well, we'll take a break now, shall we, till, let us say, 20 to 2.
So yes, and then we have one witness for this afternoon, Mr. Evans.
Thank you.